I do not live in the Mediterranean, where it is warm and sunny, then wet and cool. Ancient Greece only had 3 seasons, roughly equating to spring, summer, fall. Winter, and how we understand it, is simply not something the ancients concerned themselves with. No blizzards, no doors stuck frozen in ice. But I live in the north, in a landscape known for its harsh and unforgiving winters. We don't simply rain and bury our grain in stores. Here the sun sets at 3 p.m. And in the places where my ancestors came from, the sun sometimes never rises at all. Soon we will be blanketed by thick layers of snow and ice and silence. Or at least that was once true. But now the landscape is changing. Winter has always been one of my favorite seasons. There's some deep magic, perhaps once shown to be my grandfather and the ghost of my great-grandmother. That is what initially drew me to Norse heathenry, honoring Thor and the beings of snow. Ultimately, it didn't fit. It can be hard to explain why something's not right, but when you know and seek elsewhere. But still, in the winter, I find it hard to connect to my polytheist path. My Apollo is in Hyperborea, Demeter and Kore are resting. Zeus brooms as a brutal storm, and even Hermes' winged feet feel like they stiffen. As nature turns to stillness, so do I. The winter is changing. This is the warmest December that I can remember. So the cold that once existed around me congeals within. My practice has always had to adapt. And so I must learn to adapt again, because the world is changing, and it is not the same from one year to the next. My hearth burns stronger this time of year. My devotion to Hestia roars to life. I see Chione, the nymph of snow, in the glistening crystalline landscape. I see Artemis, too, related to the frost that kills the crops. She is the huntress, after all, and the hunt has only begun. And so I must turn somewhere else. Somewhere older, somewhere inside of me, to the crown I found in my parents' attic, sent to me by distant relatives, a wreath of electric lights. And so I turned to her, that age-old tradition, Sankta Lucia.
Hi, I'm Fel the Blythe, your local winter-loving gremlin. Today's video is a simultaneous exploration into syncretism and the Scandinavian tradition of Sankta Lucia, which occurs every year on December 13th, which will be tomorrow, if this goes up on time. So let's start with a definition. Syncretism. Syncretism is the combining of different beliefs and various schools of thought. Syncretism involves the merging or assimilation of several mythologies or religions, thus asserting an underlying unity and allowing for an inclusive approach to other faiths. Syncretism has been around since literally as long as religion has existed. Syncretism has also existed. The ancient Greeks were constantly syncretizing their gods and their traditions. They did interpantheon syncs, like Artemis, Hecate, Selene, which I have talked about before. Later on, between different pantheons, most notably the Egyptians and the Romans. The Norse were also known for their syncretism, and many cultures have syncretized their own beliefs with, say, that of Catholicism, sometimes forming unique, diverse traditions. Italian folk Catholicism looking different than Irish folk Catholicism as a result of various forms of syncretism. Or sometimes it creates a sect of Christianity that looks almost nothing like its original form. This video is not going to be me necessarily explaining super in depth what syncretism is, or explain the difference between syncretism and eclecticism, because there is a difference. It's probably a pretty big one. If you are interested in that, please check out YouTuber Darling's video on syncretism, eclecticism, and perennialism, what they are and what the difference is. So how does syncretism show up in my life? Syncretism shows up for various reasons throughout different cultures, but for me, it shows up for two main reasons. One, there is a cultural tradition of my family that means a lot to me, and I wish also was integrated with my faith practice. And then the second reason is that in my faith practice, because of where I live, there feels like there's quite a large gap. Especially true when it comes to wintertime and solstice traditions. That was not something the ancient Greeks, at least where we have most of our sources from, but I live up north, and I do have to concern myself with these things. Since I was a young girl, my family has more or less done something for Sankta Lucia, the celebration of Sankta Lucia. This is a tradition that I've carried with me as I've lived and moved to places on my own, but it's always felt sometimes kind of shoehorned into my spiritual life. It's very much been a part of my holiday tradition for quite some time, and it's always felt connected to me. It never felt like it connected to my practice, from New Age to witchcraft. I didn't really even integrate it when I was a Norse heathen for a little while, but I've slowly started to change that. And before I talk about how I started to adapt that tradition into my own new syncretized tradition with Sankta Lucia, let me acquaint you with the tradition of Sankta Lucia, in both how to celebrate it today and where it came from. I just wanted to give a glimpse into my life that's not just all Hellenism. So who was Santa Lucia? Now you notice earlier I said Sankta Lucia. Sankta Lucia is the Swedish pronunciation, but the proper pronunciation is Santa Lucia, because Saint Lucy, Santa Lucia, is a Christian saint coming from Syracuse in Sicily. She was alleged to exist in around 304 CE. There are many hagiographies, a saint's biography of Saint Lucy, but this is not a folk Catholic or Christian mysticism channel, so I'm not going to go into all of the details of Saint Lucy, but I want to acquaint you with her so you can understand some of what I will be talking about later. So from here on out, you'll hear me alternate between Lucia and Lucia. There's not really a reason why I alternate between them. I grew up saying Lucia because my family is Swedish, but Lucia is the proper pronunciation, how a lot of people say it, so I will also say that from time to time. So the basic story of Santa Lucia is this. She was born in a wealthy family in Sicily. Her father likely of Roman origin and her mother of Greek origin. After her father's death at a young age, her mother arranged a marriage for her to a pagan man. Lucia had already sworn to live as a virgin and in service of God. Lucia decided to give all away her family's riches to the poor, because give now to the true Savior while you are still healthy, whatever you intended to give away at your death. Her suitor found out about this, and she was reported to the Roman authorities. The governor of Syracuse ordered her to burn a sacrifice in honor of the imperial cult, in honor of the emperor. She refused, so he ordered her to be sold to a brothel. As is classic in virgin martyr hagiographies, no matter how they tried to capture her, she somehow always evaded it. Something supernatural would get in their way. Eventually, however, Santa Lucia met her demise by sword to the throat. The other stories of Lucia that are important to the traditional Luciadagen, which is St. Lucy's Day in Swedish, is the story that involves the most famous icon from Luciadagen in the wreath of candles upon a young girl's head. That story comes from some sort of tale that was passed down of Lucia was bringing supplies to Christians who were hiding from persecution in the catacomb. In order to work most effectively, she had to use both her hands, but that meant that she couldn't hold any candles, so she placed a wreath upon her head and carried the candles that way, thus bringing light into the darkness. Another important aspect of Lucia that is missing from her hagiography is her association with eyes. If you see any depictions of her, most of the time she's holding her eyes. In some versions of her myth, she met her death not by sword to the throat, but by torture of the eyes. In still another version, she commits an Oedipus in order to discourage her suitor. I think that's pretty metal. If a guy thinks you're too pretty, and don't have to worry about that anymore, I guess, according to the story. Lucia was super popular cross-culturally. Even in 8th century Britain, there were already 2 churches dedicated to her, and this is when Britain was still largely pagan. Lucia is from Sicily, and the tradition that I'm talking about is from Sweden. Very, very far apart. So how on earth did a Sicilian saint make her way to be one of the most important saints in a Protestant country, Sweden. There's a couple of logical explanations for this. She came via sailors. People were trading and brought the message of Santa Lucia to Sweden. Her feast day was already on the darkest part of the year in the Julian calendar, December 13th. And in many parts of Sweden, the sun doesn't rise at all on December 13th. So it makes sense that a saint who brought light would be very heavily revered in a place like Sweden. The more mythological and likely erroneous story comes from the Middle Ages. I did struggle to find an exact time frame, likely because it's an erroneous mythological story. The province of Värmland was experiencing a great famine. Just when all seemed lost, on December 13th, a ship appeared on Lake Vänern, the largest lake in Sweden and the third largest in all of Europe. At the helm of the ship was a woman clothed in white and crowned with light. She then came and distributed food and clothing, and that woman was Sankta Lucia. And she has been sacred to the Swedish people ever since, or so the story goes. So the history of Luciadagen. Now we know about the saint. We know how she gets to Sweden. But how do we get from her coming to this celebration that is recognized by certain people who are not even Swedish? It's kind of a hallmark of Sweden in many ways. So Sankta Lucia, also known as the Old Winter Solstice, Little Yule, Lucimas, Lucinata, Luciadagen, or the Feast of St. Lucy, is a festival celebrated in Nordic countries. Tracing the history of the festival was actually very difficult. It's surprisingly hard to trace living traditions because sometimes your source literally is, that's the way my family did it. There's no really arguing with that. There's no disproving that. You can't really expand on that. But never fear. I am Fel the Blythe and I love to research and spend hours when I'm supposed to be doing other things, going on to the Swedish Wikipedia site and finding sources for that. Lots of Google Translate. The first record of Luciadagen in the way that we see it celebrated today with the wreath of candles, a young girl giving food of some kind in a white dress, was recorded in Värmland by C.F.R. Nyman. In an unpublished work, he describes being visited by a young girl dressed in white with a sash of red carrying food, drink, and singing. Another account comes from the province of Södermanland, in which Ebba Sparre has described in a letter to her sister how she was awakened by playing the violin, and when she opened her eyes, she saw two of the maids with the caretaker's daughter and housekeeper enter the house, completely white-clad with flower garlands on their heads, carrying with them a kind of altar with a basket in gold paper and with 16 burning candles. First documentation of a Lucia with a wreath of candles on their head comes from the 1820s by a mill inspector in Skinnskatteberg. I apologize to any Swedes out there for my pronunciations of these things. This mill inspector wrote, "The double doors to the vestibule were opened, and a servant dressed in white sheets entered, with a wreath of candles on his head and carrying a huge bonfire with mulled wine. Actually, it should have been a maid, for he was to represent Sankta Lucia, but probably for the sake of the burden, a man has been taken to it in recent times." Although there is some evidence to suggest that feasts and offerings were made prior to the C.F.R. Nyman account in the 18th century. However, it's clear that when C.F.R. Nyman was writing all of this stuff, that the tradition was obviously well established. Didn't just spontaneously appear out of nowhere. Likely, it was already commonplace amongst folks of all classes and landscapes of Sweden. Again, surprisingly difficult to trace living traditions. But prior to Luciadagen, you have the traditional Lussinata. Lussi night is the night of Lussi, Lussi. This was likely celebrated sometime beginning in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Lussi, a very familiar witch-like figure who had no connection to St. Lucy besides having a similar sounding name and occurring around the winter solstice. Lucy and her nightmarish entourage would come around and inspect to see how you were doing, how you were preparing for the Christmas season. If you were found to be wanting, she would unleash her monsters, and if you were very unlucky, she would snatch you and your children. I bring up Lussinata because it does have some holdover in the modern Luciadagen. There are certain traditions that kind of blended their way together. Syncretism. For example, there's the practice of lusevaka, which was the idea of staying awake throughout the Lucinat, the darkest night of the year, to guard the home against evil. This has now been kind of translated to be, ooh, let's party all night. But I mean, those also kind of existed in the ancient world too. Scare away the dark by throwing a rager. You see, in many Northern European countries, Yuletide was more akin to how we view Samhain or Halloween today. It was the darkest night of the year, and so that was when evil spirits, ghosts, trolls, Lucy were said to roam freely. Anyone, adult or child, was loath to be caught outside during this time, and even still there are some traditions of between Luciadagen and Christmas is when the most evil are on the land. I also have personally always felt a stronger connection to the winter solstice than I have to, say, Halloween or Samhain, though partly because of growing up with a lot of stories of my Swedish family. I just have always felt very connected to winter, and it gets very, very dark. Very dark here, especially where I am. Like, it's already getting dark and it's 3:40. I've always viewed the winter solstice as more of a time when the dead roam, at least for my personal practice, than I have during Halloween, say. So celebrating Luciadagen today. The modern celebration of Luciadagen, or simply Lucia, my family specifically would call it Sankta Lucia, but also any other name that I've mentioned before will work as well. The modern tradition of that began in 1927, when Stockholm selected a national Lucia and held a procession as part of a publicity stunt for their newspaper. It was so popular, however, that local newspapers all over Sweden were picking up the tradition and assigning their towns Lucia. And that tradition continues to this day. While originally Santa Lucia was just Swedish in origin, adopted by Finland in the early 1900s, and became widespread in 1930 with their first large celebration. Denmark adopted it during World War II as sort of a subversive protest to their Nazi occupation and to bring light to the darkness that was facing their country at that time. And then it was adopted by Norway following World War II, presumably for very similar reasons of bringing light to the darkness the world had just experienced. Norway is the country that celebrated Lucianaut the most. This was the night of spirits, trolls, and witches, and they actually celebrated this regularly up until the 1900s. Scandinavia is the most secular part of the world, and only in Denmark is Luciadagen considered religious. This explains a little bit why I kind of struggled to connect to Santa Lucia on a spiritual level, because, well, it wasn't celebrated spiritually by my ancestors. Santa Lucia is traditionally the eldest daughter, but in some areas, especially those with moxie-filled younger daughters, it is the youngest. The Lucia dons a garb of white, symbolizing a baptismal robe, and then a sash of red, symbolizing her martyrdom. She then dons a crown of candles. Growing up, I had an electric one sent to us by relatives. I recently decided to try to make my own. Every year it's been very difficult. This year is no exception. I graduated to using an actual wreath this year instead of just putting LEDs on my head. I'll work on the candles next year. One day, I will walk around with fire on my head, and it will be beautiful. The Lucia then gets up before dawn to brew coffee and glögg. She then brings around lussekatter, saffron buns, which are made to symbolize both sleeping cats, katter, and Lucia's eyes, like I mentioned earlier, and sometimes ginger cookies. She then walks around, greet each family member of the household, singing with breakfast to signify that the darkest dark has come and gone, and now the light with the dawn will return. I've celebrated Sankta Lucia since I was a young girl with my wreath of candles that were sent to me by some Swedish relatives. It tragically no longer fits me. I really wish it did. I can't remember, honestly, when we started celebrating Sankta Lucia, but in every place I've ever lived, I have placed a crown upon my head and carried the tradition with me. I don't know when I first heard the tale of staying up all night, but as a young girl, I would certainly try to stay up all night and stay up until the break of dawn. In my family, we didn't make saffron buns because saffron is the world's most expensive spice. Also was very little, and it was like a lot of work to do all the yeast and everything for that. So instead, a couple days prior, go to our local IKEA and buy their cinnamon buns. And then in the morning, I would try to get up before dawn, usually 3 a.m. I think 3 or 4 a.m. was when I would try to wake up, and I would get the cinnamon buns ready, put them on a nice tray, make everyone hot chocolate or coffee, and throwing my siblings' doors open and scream singing them awake at dawn. Now we're finally back at the beginning that I mentioned. What Sankta Lucia means to me and how I have started trying to make this tradition relate to me on a spiritual and religious level. The meaning of Sankta Lucia has changed over the years with me. While I acknowledged the saint herself, for most of my time it was never really about her. She was more just a stand-in for the symbol of the winter solstice. For me, it was always about honoring my great-grandmother, who chased the deadly blizzards away, who left for me her copy of the Eddas. It was about celebrating my love of historical dress, crafting a kamichial my own. It's about honoring the earth, because each winter I worry it will be the last time that I see snow, so I want to relish in it. I don't want to chase away the winter, but rather honor it and hold space for it here. However, this year, Sankta Lucia has taken on a new meaning, as I have started looking at Sankta Lucia no longer just as a symbol, but as a divine figure, as a saint. She is a patron saint of writers after all, and I do a lot of writing. Late one night, a couple of weeks ago, I lay in bed, using as I do, when suddenly I was struck with really what I can only describe as a mystical and spiritual realization for my own personal syncretism. Around a couple of weeks ago, I learned that my dearly beloved Artemis is also a goddess of the frost. She is also a light-bringing goddess. She is a maiden, sworn to be one forever. She also is depicted carrying torches, and in some versions of the myth of Kore and Demeter, she becomes Hecate and dives deep into the catacombs looking for her playmate. It was in that moment, as the cold descended upon me, sipping hot chocolate, that I realized something, that I am allowed to make my own personal syncretisms. And I suddenly saw Lucia as Artemis and Artemis as Lucia. A syncretized version, however, Artemis-Lucia. Artemis is the one with the golden bow. She's a light-bringer phosphorus. She is also goddess of frost, according to Callimachus, which I recently learned, especially the frost that kills the crops at the beginning of winter. I have personally associated Artemis with winter already, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my video. And I just thought it was so interesting, the imagery of Lucia descending into the catacombs and Artemis as Hecate descending into the underworld to look, to bring hope, to find and chase after that spring which has gone. Artemis was also syncretized within her own pantheon with Artemis Hecate Selene, which I have mentioned in my Hecate video. Studius Statius says in his Theobaid, "Queen of the mysteries of the night, if as they say thou dost vary in threefold wise the aspect of thy godhood, and in different shape comest down into the woodland, the goddess stooped her horns and made bright her kindly star, and illuminated the battlefield with the near approaching chariot." This idea of Artemis Hecate Selene coming down and bringing light into the world with the horns, or a wreath. And this is something I think I'll be working on for a little bit, because the point of syncretism is not just like eclecticism. It's just not just mashing things together. It's finding two aspects of within two pantheons and in a way in which they become one. To me, Artemis-Lucia would be an almost chthonic aspect of Artemis, perhaps, descending down into the earth, bringing light to all those who are weary, bringing the frost, but also the warmth for ascending above. We're not taught how to syncretize things. It just sort of happens, and not told how to blend traditions together in a way that makes sense to our souls, and what also makes sense culturally. It's not honoring Artemis, who is Lucia, or Lucia, who is Artemis. It's not saying that they are inherently always the same, but it is choosing to sync them together into one thing. If you have ever syncretized any gods together or any beings together, especially if they have never been syncretized before, let me know down in the comments. And also, even if they have been syncretized before, how do they show up for you? And what makes them different from, say, their individual aspects? I would really love to know. Syncretism is very new to me. I don't know. I'm excited to see where this goes. I'm excited to blend two aspects of my life together that have never really been conjoined in any way. When I place the wreath of lights upon my head, it is for Artemis Phosphorus, the bringer of light. It is for Sotera, Lucy who saved Värmland, and for Artemis who has saved many others. I place it on my head for my great-grandmother, and for her Eddas, and for her mother and father, who crossed the endless, choppy, cold, bitter sea. But there was light rising up to greet them, and it rises up to greet you. The day has grown dark, but the turning point has come, and ever brighter the light will grow. Glad Sankta Lucia, everybody. May you find what works for you, and forge ahead a tradition of your own. I have a lot to think about, and I will see you shortly. Goodbye, everybody.
Come here.
It's my little man. Oh, he didn't like it. Oh,